The warp. Date unavailable. There was no perception of how long he was not. But then, all of a sudden, he was again, and there was fire and pain, and the laughter of cruel gods. This was all horribly familiar, and for a terrible moment, Asim thought that he had died, that his last-ditch escape had failed, that he had missed some trap in the pact that had guaranteed his escape, and was trapped in the warp forever. Then the flames dimmed, the laughter faded, and he found himself back aboard the Hand of Ruin, an unimaginable distance away from the Camaros system. The sounds of the Forsaken Sun's flagship surrounded him. A ship was never truly silent, but anyone who lived aboard one for some time learned the different undercurrents, and could differentiate between one ship's symphony and another's, as well as pick up the nuances relating to the ship's current status. Right now, the Hand of Ruin was sailing through the warp, and Asim felt the slight tremor indicating that the engines were being pushed close to their limit. It was a faint and distant sound, though. He was in the deep holds of the vessel, several decks away from the areas patrolled by legionaries no matter in which direction he went. Mortal slaves, and mutated riches descended from them, scurried away from him as he made his way through the ship's corridors. His left leg was still petrified inside his armor, making his advance an awkward limp as he was forced to rely on his rune-marked staff for support. Most of the systems of his armor had been fried, including the Vox, and he didn't feel strong enough to call for assistance telepathically. There were things in the Hand of Ruin that even the Forsaken Sons were cautious of, and a psychic call might draw them to him. There was another reason for his reluctance, however. Asim was one of Arkan's chosen, but he had failed in his appointed task. The imprisoned had been released, but not bound to the Black Crusade's cause. All the assets he had been entrusted with to make his lord's will a reality had been lost, even Carthago. He didn't think Arkan would kill him for it, but the Sorcerer of Blood had enemies, even within the Warband itself. The Forsaken Sons were, by and large, free of the infighting that his research had shown him plagued so many other fragments of the Nine Legions, but that wasn't an absolute. Rivalries existed between warriors and squads, even among the Warband's core of veterans Arkan had rescued from the siege's undignified end. Asim's own position as leader of the Coven had earned him the enmities of several warriors, and he knew there were other sorcerers who coveted the position. The sorcerous experiments he had conducted along the Fleshmasters had also drawn the hatred of many of the Unbound, though those were less of a problem. Very few of them were left aboard the Hand of Ruin, most of them having been dispatched to Bernos as part of the Unbound host. He didn't think any of them were likely to take advantage of his weakness, but after barely escaping one disaster, he had no intention to tempt fate. The Dark God's sense of humor was a twisted thing, and he suspected it would amuse them greatly to have him murdered by his own brothers after miraculously escaping death at the hands of the false Emperor's chosen executioners. For days, Asim walked. At some point, he had to defend himself from one of the mindless beasts that haunted the deep holes, killing it with his staff before forcing himself to eat its flesh to replenish his diminishing strength. Always he sought to go up, toward the populated decks. Eventually, he reached the lowest levels of what might be called civilization aboard the Hand of Ruin. The tribes that lived there were awed and terrified of him, and he quickly dominated them, using them as messengers to bring word of his return to their overlords. Finally, a squad of Forsaken Sons came down and found him. After verifying that he was who he claimed to be, which involved another member of the Coven touching minds with him to ensure he wasn't a demon wearing the Sorcerer of Blood skin, Asim was brought back to his quarters. On the way, he was told that his arrival had been detected 9 on-board days earlier, as the imprisoned tore through the ship's skeller field and deposited him in the deep holds. His arrival had triggered a series of demonic incursions as the predators of the Empyrean took advantage of the breach. Within the safety of his quarters, Asim managed to use sorcery to restore his leg to flesh, though it remained stiff. He stayed in his armor, not trusting his thralls to help him remove it while he was so diminished. He managed to make a few repairs himself, but it was clear he would need to make the trip to the forges and ask the heretics under Mercurian to assist him to restore it to full functionality. He spent another hour painstakingly going over the wards engraved on the inside and outside of his helmet, sorcerous seals meant to guard his mind and soul from the Neverborn, before being satisfied he had repaired the damage they had sustained during his impromptu trip through the Sea of Souls. Only then did he allow himself to rest, closing his eyes as he sat cross-legged on the ground, inside the warding circle that covered most of his room's floor. A few hours later, he was summoned by Arkan. The awakened one was staring straight into the warp when Asim came to him. The Lord of the Forsaken Sun stood in an observation bay atop one of the warship's spires, behind a gate guarded by two of his Terminator bodyguards who had let Asim pass only reluctantly. Apparently, they knew his abrupt return was the reason for the demonic incursions whose damage Asim had seen on his way there, and weren't happy with anything that interfered with the plans of their lord at this late hour. Still, Asim had been called by Arkan, so they let him pass without protest. The Sorcerer of Blood made his way up a spiraling staircase made of living bone, somehow strong enough to bear his weight without cracking, and entered the observation bay. The detritus of observation devices that had once occupied the chamber had been pushed to the side, leaving an empty space at the center of which stood Arkan, his unblinking eyes fixed upon the raging maelstrom beyond. They had changed since Asim had last seen him, transformed into twin pits of hellfire by the terrible boons the dark gods had bestowed upon Arkan for the Black Crusade he had unleashed. Asim wondered what his lord saw. Like everyone else, the Sorcerer Lord saw things in the unfiltered warp. Unlike most people, however, his training meant that he could see those things without going mad. He was used to drawing upon the energies of the Empyrean with his brain. After all, seeing them with his eyes was almost relaxing by comparison. The tides of the Immaterium were held at bay by the Geller fields surrounding the Hand of Ruin, but the Sorcerer Lord could still see faces there. Millions of human faces, dancing and shifting before he could get a good look at them. There were shadows there too, of great monsters with burning red eyes and open maws that hunted down the human echoes. Asim felt that he knew where they were. "We are sailing into the graveyard," confirmed Arkan, still staring into the warp. An entire subsector wiped out by the orcs centuries ago, its population eradicated so thoroughly the Imperium still hasn't tried to recolonize it. Even now, the warp echoes with the screams of those who perished in those purges, and the horror of their final moments. Much as I would like to laugh at the Imperium's weakness for being unable to face a bunch of greenskins, what we have learned of this beast does make the dismal performance of our cousins more understandable. Especially after how Gulaman's reforms crippled them. Asim remained silent, and walked to the side of his lord. Arkan continued, "Did you know that the Azarok system lies in this region? The orcs targeted it first, destroying the sector's high command with one of their attack moons before spreading to the rest of the subsector. Kemiros became the capital of the sector after the war, but the sector's name remained the same. Decaros told me that apparently, the request is still logged in the gears of the Administratum, somewhere on Terra." Again, Asim remained silent. Finally, the awakened one finally turned toward his chosen. "All right. Tell me what happened, Asim." Asim told him, leaving nothing out of his report and making no excuses for his failure. When he was done, he fell on his knees, bowing his head and awaiting his judgment. He felt the weight of Arkan's gaze upon him, and his instincts were screaming at him to get up and fight for his life, but he ignored them. Even if he had been inclined to such base treachery, in his current state, he held no illusion as to his chances anyway. "Are you certain," asked Arkan softly, "that Fel's Herost, that Chiron is dead?" Asim blinked. That hadn't been the response he had expected. "As certain as can be," he replied. "Carthago burned herself alongside him, and I felt the power imbued into that fire." "I see," mused Arkan, his eyes briefly flickering to the storm outside. "Then it is working. Good. Excellent, even." His gaze returned to Asim, and he gestured impatiently. "Get up, brother. Carthago's loss wasn't anything I hadn't planned for. I am glad you managed to escape. The unbinding of the imprisoned one is a lost opportunity, but you made the correct decision in choosing to release it once it was clear no bargain could be made." "I don't understand," admitted Asim as he rose to his feet. It was a dangerous thing to say, and not one he would ever have spoken aloud if the two hadn't been alone. "How is this anything but a dismal failure?" Arkan looked at him for several seconds, pondering whether to share more with his chosen. Eventually, he decided to go ahead and do so. "It all comes down to what the Grey Knights, or at least their current leaders and most ancient members, really are, brother," he began. "We are fighting to rewrite a fate cleaved from the heavens by the false emperor himself, in the final days before he was maimed and his power broken. Such a thing cannot be done without sacrifices, and sacrifices only have meaning if they truly diminish the one making them." Understanding struck Asim like a thunderbolt. It should have felt like a betrayal, but it didn't, Perhaps because Arkan had never made a mystery of how he viewed the entire warband, including himself, as a weapon to wield against the Imperium until it broke. He took good care of that weapon, yes, but that was only in order to continue to inflict damage upon the empire they had once built.
You used us as bait, said Asim quietly.
Not just Carthago and I, all of us.
You left Aloran to die beneath the broken tower, Arkan pointed out.
It was a diversion from your work, but one that the Imperium couldn't afford to ignore.
I did the same with you. With all of my chosen I scattered across Azeroth.
Paranefer alone succeeded in the mission I gave him, though it cost him his life.
Then,
the others are all?
Yes, confirmed Arkan.
You and Malone are the only ones who escaped.
Paranefer, Karalit, the Unfettered, they were all hunted down by the Grey Knights and killed.
But they forced the Imperials to separate their forces, because they couldn't allow even one of them to continue their activities unchecked. It took a band of the Grey Knights' greatest killers to slay Hector Hecaranal. They sent the finest blades of their entire chapter to Andros Rest, veterans of the Scouring whose false names are cursed by entire choirs of Neverborn. And now, thanks to the Blood Champion's sacrifice, they will be too late to join the Imperium's final attempt to stop us. At the cost of the strongest warrior in the entire warband, and several of our best demonists, said Asim. Not to mention that we lost our chance to awaken the slumbering world soul of that world. With it, we could have turned every Imperial soldier and Blood Angel descendant on that world to our side, one way or another.
Arkan nodded. Yes. A heavy price, I agree. Ezirithn was quite disappointed as well when I told him the news.
The firstborn of the Shailat had been the one to tell the Forsaken Sons about the world that the Imperium called Andros Rest, and the psychic construct that laid beneath its surface,
left there from the time when the children of Aisha ruled the galaxy unopposed.
As legacies of the Eldar Empire went, it wasn't all that grand, but it would have been a fine weapon, if it could have been awakened in the fullness of its bitter fury. The psychic Gestalt had been driven mad by the fall of the Eldar, and the unattended shard of their war god within it had turned from honorable warfare, as if such a thing existed, to pure, bloody-minded fury aimed at all living things. When the Orcs had invaded Andros Rest during the War of the Beast, the violence had been enough to make it stir, turning the decadent Imperial nobles into guerrillas who had survived years of brutal conflict with the Greenskins. With it fully awakened, Hector could have launched a new blood crusade, tearing a path of mayhem and slaughter across the stars. Ezirithn would have loved to see it, for all that his darkling soul belonged to Slanch, the opposite power Hector Hecaran had served. Defiling relics of his people was something that gave the Xenos great pleasure. Asim had asked him if he knew any details about the imprisoned before leaving, but apparently that had been before even his time.
But that is my point, continued Arkan. For all his might, Hector Hecaran was still struck down.
Mere martial prowess cannot explain this. The Grey Knights sent squads to do the job of armies, like we once were for the Imperial army during the Great Crusade. The power of the false emperor within them bends chance and destiny to ensure their triumph, Asim, and it is strongest among the oldest of them, who received it directly from him. This is what you discussed with Abaddon, the sorcerer of blood realized. When you used Garion and that witch he brought along from Elder to make contact with him.
Asim hadn't been present when that had happened, being busy elsewhere in the Wailing Storm. But it had been an impressive feat of sorcery, and he had discussed it at length with Garion, before the mortal had been sent with the Unfettered to assist him in his mad experiments. Garion hadn't remembered much of the actual discussion, though. The demands of the spell, combined with his awe at the sight of Abaddon's projection, had been enough to warp most of his memory of the event, and the witch hadn't been even less useful when he had questioned her. Not that he had pressed too far for answers. Arkan's sorceress meeting with the former first captain of the Sons of Horus, who had since become Warmaster of the so-called Black Legion, was something only the Chosen knew, with Garion and Miriana, yes, that had been her name, being sworn to secrecy. The Forsaken Sons weren't part of Abaddon's grand army of renegades, but the implication that they might be wouldn't have been good for morale. Arkan nodded.
Ezekiel knows many things. Some were revealed to him by his spies, others by his seers, and still others by the gods themselves. He doesn't trust any of them blindly, but the threat of the Grey Knights was confirmed from many different sources.
And what did Abaddon tell you of them?
He told me that the false emperor created them to be his secret weapon in the wars to come. Even as Horus fleets advanced on Terra,
The manipulative bastard was planning for the ages to come. The Chaos Lord's gauntleted hands tightened into fists. Even now, we do not know how much of this he planned out. But we do know that the Grey Knights are key to his plan. The fire of Arkan's eyes suddenly flared, the eldritch power feeding off the warlord's emotions as he continued. As long as the founders of the Grey Knights live, there can be no true victory against the Imperium. They are his ace in the hole, and he has made them so powerful, so warded against doom, that any plan they stand against will fail, no matter how grand. And that, Asim, is unacceptable. Asim almost took a step back. To his sixth sense, the hatred that radiated from the Awakened One was a physical thing, a pressure on his mind and soul. Arkan was no psyker, even now, but he had drunk deep of the Dark God's cup in order to gain the power and knowledge needed for the Black Crusade, and it had left marks on him. Past the reinforced windows and the Geller field, the tides of the warp themselves reacted to the Chaos Lord's fury, twisting into images of burning worlds and infinite armies of black-clad monstrosities. It had been a long time, he reflected, since Arkan had let loose his emotions like this. This was the rage at the core of his soul, the fury born in the crucible of the siege's shameful ending and the defeat of the rebels. It was the rage that had united the Forsaken Sons, and cowed worlds and demons alike into terrified obedience. Most of the time, it burned cold, and was bound by ruthless pragmatism, but every so often, one could catch a glimpse of the true rage that lay beneath, a rage that would destroy the galaxy in the name of vengeance if it could. Part of him felt honored that Arkan trusted him enough to show him this, while another was worried he might succumb to his rage and lash out at anything or anyone in sight. But the will of the Awakened One was strong, and after a few moments on the knife's edge, he restored his mask of calm. This is why they must be bled, Arkan went on as if nothing had just happened. They must be weakened. Their champions must be cast down, their secret knowledge burned, and most important of all, their leader, Janus, whose true name has been burned from the warp itself even more thoroughly than Fel's Herost's was, must die, so that whatever he planned for him is brought to naught. The Nightmare Fleet is a weapon, a threat, powerful enough to bend destiny by its mere existence. Powerful enough to draw him out of hiding, away from the path the Corpse God forged for him. Asim had to ask. Do you even intend to unleash it, or is this a bluff to draw the Grey Knights out? Arkan laughed, with more than a hint of madness in it. Of course I do. My plan couldn't work if I didn't. And make no mistake, Asim, I want to. With the blessing of the ruinous powers and the head of Janus, I could control the Nightmare Fleet, and use it to wreak bloody vengeance upon the entire Imperium. The scale of the Awakened One's plan was breathtaking. He sought nothing less than to make a move of his own in the great game, to play at the same level as the Dark Gods and the Emperor themselves. Arkan smiled, and it was a cold and dreadful thing, revealing filed teeth engraved with a mix of Chthonian and chaotic runes that shone with the same inner light as his burning eyes. And do you know the best part? Janus knew exactly what I was doing, but he had no choice. I forced his hand and made him splinter the host he had gathered to crush us. Now, when we finally face one another, his sword of light will have been reduced to a dagger. And it won't be enough. I will kill him, and with his death I will bring all of the false Emperor's plans for him to naught. If you can kill him, pointed out Asim. I doubt it will be easy. Nothing worth doing is ever easy, brother. I have prepared for this. And you have just brought me proof that the theory behind it works. After all, Carthago was able to kill Chiron. There was more to it, Asim knew. He didn't know who the Grey Knights' leader, their equivalent of a chapter master, he supposed, this Janus was, but to have one such as Fel's Herost as a subordinate, it must be a figure straight out of legend. Chiron had already been far more powerful than Fel's Herost had ever been, so how much stronger would his superior be? But he could tell Arkan had told him all he intended to for now. I understand, said Asim at last. What is our next step? You join us at an auspicious time, your method of travel notwithstanding. We left Neril mere days ago. The vagaries of warp travel made it so that the Imperials were hot on our trail, however, they arrived just as we left. And you will be surprised to hear that the slaves of the false Emperor have made common cause with the elders, explained Arkan with something that could very generously be called a smile. Then you found it? Asked Asim. Arkan nodded. Yes. The location of the Nightmare Fleet is ours, and Mercurian has cracked its secrets.
Your brethren of the Coven have troubled the warp behind us to prevent the Imperials from just following us, and I have left Orpheus and the followers of the Dark Prince to hold the cemetery world."
"It won't be enough," said Asim.
"Mikhail is strong but has little talent for strategy, and the servants of Slunch have little thought for tactics anyway.
Unless their foes do something monumentally stupid, they won't be able to win. They do not need to. All they have to do is delay them long enough for us to gain enough of a lead so that we can make our preparations at the Nightmare Fleet's prison."
"Does Orpheus know that?"
Arkan nodded. "He does.
Truth be told,
I am not sure he cares.
he had his own reasons to want to stay behind, as did they all once they saw the Eldar with the Imperials."
Asim considered this. It made sense. Those who followed the path of excess were not the most concerned about their own survival, lost as they were to the quest for more. Arkan had managed to corral them to his purpose this far, but he had never been able to really trust them on the battlefield, except as an instrument of terror. With his plan moving into its final stages, removing such a random element from the board made sense. The arrival of the Eldar in the game would also have made retaining control over them more difficult. Slunch forever hungered for the Xenos' souls, and the Dark Prince's champions would balk at being denied a chance to fight them. Arkan returned to contemplating the madness-inducing tides of the warp. "We will meet up with the remnants of the Unbound Host and the other raiding flotillas soon, then make our way toward the Nightmare Fleet. For now, Asim, return to your quarters. Rest and recover your strength, for I shall doubtless have need of it before the end." Asim left the observation bay, and made his way back to his quarters, pondering the words of the Awakened One and their implications. He was halfway there when a voice echoed in his mind. "Plus Asim. Plus." He froze. That voice, it wasn't the voice of the Herald. The demon had been curiously silent since his escape from Camiros. But he knew that mental voice nonetheless, he just hadn't expected to ever hear it in his mind again. "Plus Carthago?" Plus he tentatively pulsed back. She was dead. He had seen her die, and while he did not mourn her, she was a Xenos abomination after all, and some conditioning couldn't be completely overcome no matter how hard he tried. He did feel regret at the circumstances of her demise. Yet it was her voice, he was certain of it. "Plus Asim, plus," repeated the voice. "Plus, are you here?" "I am cold, Asim." "Why am I cold if I burned?" "Plus." A figure emerged from the shadows, moving slowly. It was Carthago, but it wasn't all of her. Her body was translucent, and she didn't radiate the aura of barely controlled power she used to. Nevertheless, a cautious scan of her aura revealed that it was her, and not some demonic spirit trying to deceive Asim by taking her appearance. She was dead, he realized with a start. Her body had perished in the fire that had killed Chiron, just as he had thought. But it appeared that, to a psyker of her power, death didn't mean the same thing it did for most mortals. Somehow, her spirit had survived the demise of her flesh and had followed him here. But the Gellerfield was still up, and it wouldn't have made a difference between a bodiless mortal spirit and a demon. The difference between the two was a matter for philosophers as much as scholars of the universe's forbidden truths. Perhaps she had come along with him when the imprisoned had breached the Gellerfield, only showing herself to him now for reasons unknown. Regardless of the reason, she wasn't unscathed. It was clear from her words that her mind had suffered from the process, even if she had never been what one might call eloquent. That was to be expected. The soul of an Alpha Plus psyker would have drawn the never-born like sharks to spilled blood. How much of her memory had been lost before she had managed to push them back? This was a fascinating discovery, and Asim intended to study it in full. Space Marines did not know fear, but all sorcerers knew what waited for them beyond death, and any chance of avoiding it was one worth pursuing. Becoming a ghost, a wraith haunting past acquaintances, was a poor fate, but still better than the alternatives, and perhaps, with study and arcane calculations, he could improve on what Carthago had achieved through instinct and sheer power. "Plus come with me, plus," he sent to Carthago, before continuing to walk toward his quarters. She did so, silently following him, unseen by the slaves and legionaries they passed on the way. "She cannot escape forever," suddenly said the Herald of Blood as Asim walked by a gleaming brass icon of the war god. Under his helmet, Asim smiled. He hadn't thought he would be rid of the Herald so easily, but having it thwarted was always good news. "Plus you tried to devour her, didn't you? And you failed. She is too strong for you. Plus. She is dead,
replied the herald, its voice seething with anger. Her bond to you is the only anchor she has left to your side of the veil. Her soul will feed us, Father. It is inevitable. The sorcerer of blood chuckled. Plus, is that so? Interesting. Then perhaps something can yet be salvaged from this whole debacle. Plus, your schemes have come to naught. The fallen king has fled, ranted the herald. It fulfilled its pact with you and escaped before the gods could devour it. But they will have their due, Father. Before the end, all debts will be paid. I owe you nothing, Asim said out loud, staring at where his reflection should be, and instead the horned visage of the herald stood. All my pacts, all my bargains, have been paid for. It was true. Asim had been very careful to pay back all the boons he had asked for, having seen firsthand what the warp could do to those who indebted themselves to the powers. Pacts and contracts weren't inviolate, and the dark gods could force their will upon their followers at any time, but a debt owed was a foothold in the materium. Or at least, that was how Asim thought of it. He wasn't arrogant enough to think his interpretation of the Sea of Souls was the correct one. But it was a useful perspective, and as long as he clung to it, it provided him some measure of protection. It wasn't perfect, even with it in the rubric coursing through his soul. Despite him not having set foot on the planet of sorcerers since the gathering of the 9 legions, his body was riddled with mutations under his armor. But it had kept him from madness and degeneration, despite the terrible powers he had manipulated in the Warband service. The herald laughed, and Asim felt Carthago cower behind him. You aren't the only one on this ship who has made promises to the gods, Father. The chains of oaths can be pulled both ways. The voice of the herald faded away. Then, to Asim's surprise, so did its image, replaced in the brass by the Sorcerer Lord's own reflection, something he hadn't seen in decades. He hesitantly reached up and pulled his helmet off, seeing his own face for the first time in decades in the brass. The color of his skin seemed to be the same dusky tone that prevailed among the natives of Prospero. It was difficult to tell on the brass. Chalk-white lines ran across his head, however, forming serpentine patterns all over his skull that crisscrossed with blackish veins. The color of his eyes had changed too, they were now kaleidoscopes of color. All in all, he judged, he couldn't complain about his looks. He had certainly seen worse among the other Forsaken Sons. He replaced his helmet before something could take advantage of his exposed mind, and resumed his walk to his quarters, Carthago following behind as he thought in silence. Had whatever had happened between Asim, the imprisoned, Carthago and the herald damaged his connection to the Cornate demon? Or was it just that the herald's attempts on Carthago's spirit had drained its strength below the point where it could maintain its haunting of the sorcerer? More importantly, however, what had its last words meant? Azarok Sector, Cemetery World Neril. 745.M32. It had been said, in the high spires of the Azarok sector, that Neril was covered in graves from pole to pole, and that catacombs extended from its surface to its molten core. This was something of an exaggeration. There were plenty of temples to the God Emperor and monuments to the greatest martyrs of the War of the Beast as well, and even the engineers of the Mechonicus could only dig so far without the planet collapsing. But the sentiment behind it was correct. Neril belonged to the dead, and the living were there only as caretakers. For all that the planet was covered in graves and mausoleums, it was still home to a small living population of barely 1 million inhabitants, descendants of the survivors found across the graveyard after the War of the Beast. Scattered in small settlements, each responsible for the maintenance of a district of the planetary graveyard, they were a grim people, dedicated to honoring the martyred dead so that their spirits may find their way to the God Emperor's side. Sustained from supplies delivered every decade by the ecclesiarchy, they worked tirelessly to honor their obligations, and had no idea of the calamities that had befallen Azarok, until the Black Crusade came for them. When the Hand of Ruin and its accompanying fleet had arrived in orbit and unleashed their cargo of monsters, the Nerilites had rallied to stop them from desecrating the world that was their charge, despite knowing full well they stood no chance of victory or survival. The sheer size of the planet and their lack of technological advancement, however, ended up saving their lives. The Forsaken Sons were only interested in a single location on Neril, and only a few hundred Nerilites were close enough to be caught in the attack. Archon had led the assault on the cemetery world himself, taking with him his own personal guard and a host of his veterans. These ancient warriors had cut through the Imperials with ruthless speed and efficiency, wasting no time on elaborate stratagems or torments, in order to deliver to their lord what he desired. Those they had slain had been granted deaths as clean as any of the Forsaken Sun's victims could hope for. The Awakened One had little interest in the planet itself. He had taken his Chaos Marines with him into the labyrinth of catacombs spreading beneath Neryl's surface, and emerged a few days later, before returning to his flagship and setting course for the system's edge. Once Arkan was gone, the surviving Nerylites soon came to envy the dead. The Awakened One had left behind the part of his great host that was sworn to the god of excess, and they intended to take their time with the planet's people. The Slaneshi contingent gathered during the conquest of the Wailing Storm had been reinforced before the Black Crusade by the Shailat, resurrected corrupt Eldar who ruled over the City of Screams on Paraxis, which they had remade into a vision of unimaginable decadence and horror in honor of the Dark Prince of Chaos. The Slaneshi Xenos had more than honored their duties under the Accords when the Forsaken Sons had called upon them, though the Awakened One knew better than to assume they did so out of loyalty or gratitude. No, the Shailat had come to support the Black Crusade in such force for their own reasons, something everyone involved in the Black Crusade's leadership was well aware of. A full score of Shailat Gene Lords had joined the crusade, led by the first of their kind, Ezirith, who had been resurrected centuries ago aboard the Hand of Ruin by the ministrations of the now-dead Fleshmaster Jacaerus. The firstborn had left rulership over the City of Screams to his subordinates, having grown bored with the horrors he had performed there. With these alien nobles had come over 100 of their warrior caste. The true number of the Shailat's contribution, however, was in their slave troops. Even after all this time, the Shailat had never been a numerous breed, few souls of the ancient corrupt Eldar being fit for resurrection after centuries in the Silver Palace of Slunch. The Gene Lords had compensated for this with their creations, a horde of a myriad horrors given flesh by their dreadful genetic perversions. The sinister ships of the Shailat had disgorged thousands of mutated creatures on Neryl that bore only the slightest resemblance with the human beings that formed the basis of their genetic makeup. Many of them bore further augmentations, devices crafted by the Shailat using technologies even the descendants of their kin in Camorra had long forgotten how to craft, or, in some cases, deliberately chosen to not use any longer. One of the reasons for this degree of mobilization was the desire to find new playthings, and they were indulging it now. The morbid death priests of Neryl were hunted down for sport amidst their former domains, and those unlucky enough to be taken alive soon discovered the true meaning of horror and torment. It had been years since the Gene Lords of the Shailat had been able to experiment with untainted human stock, and they wrought dark wonders from the clay of human flesh in their field laboratories, with those truly unfortunate being carried back to their ships, never to emerge again, at least not in any recognizable shape. Meanwhile, the cultists of Slunch gathered during the conquest of the Wailing Storm began the obscene work of consecrating Neryl's sacred grounds to the Dark Prince of Chaos. Icons of the God Emperor were cast down and reduced to rubble, while the statues of dead martyrs were defaced, altered in ways both subtle and obvious to make them more pleasing to the cultists' demented aesthetic sensibilities. Sacrifices were dragged to altars where incense had been burned to the honored dead's memory and subjected to horrible torments before being killed, their tortured souls cast into the maw of the youngest god. The chosen of Arkan Orpheus, sorcerer of Slunch, had led the dark rites, while his peer Mikhail Kashinenko descended into the depths to carry out a mission received from the Awakened One himself. The Slaneshi host's base of operation was centered around the entrance to the catacombs down which Arkan and Mikhail had gone, and every passing hour thinned the veil between Materium and Immaterium there. The surviving people of Neryl desperately fought back, but it was a battle they couldn't hope to win. Within a few days, they began to flee from the positions of the Chaos invaders, abandoning the graves their forebears had tended for generations, their faith overcome by terror. Then, just as the Hand of Ruin and its escorts left the system, a new force arrived to Neryl, bringing with them the salvation of the cemetery world. They emerged from the deep blackness of space, without the reality-sundering cataclysm that had accompanied the Forsaken Sun's entry into the warp, for they had arrived using a different path. Lord Admiral Francesco del Baranthia, who had rallied the shattered pieces of the sector's navy after the slaughter of Silberstadt, had spent ships he couldn't spare to support the Inquisition's operation. Reinforcements from the rest of the Imperium were beginning to arrive now that Beranos had been liberated, but the battered remnants of Battlefleet Azeroth were still engaging the Forsaken Sons all across the sector. The battle group of the renegade Admiral von Krugerich was harassing Imperial assets in every subsector, and the dozen warships Delbaranthia had sent to the Order Shade were ships that wouldn't fight in other engagements, which would lead to more Imperial lives being lost. But, faced with the Inquisitorial Rosette, the Lord Admiral had no choice but to obey. Agents of the Ordosh had been spread on the bridges, tasked with ensuring the Navy officers followed orders, including those who asked that they ignore a lifetime of Imperial conditioning and fight alongside filthy Xenos. Alliances with Eldar weren't unheard of in the Imperium, if kept quiet by High Command, but none of the sector's voidmen had ever even encountered one of this alien breed's ship. The Inquisitorial flotilla had met with their reinforcements 2 warp jumps away from Neril, and then made full speed toward the location given to them by their Eldar allies, where they followed their Xenos associates into the webway, traveling to Neril in mere days instead of the weeks regular warp travel would have taken them. The journey had been disturbing, for even hardened veterans of the Imperial Navy were unnerved by the alien silence of the labyrinthine dimension, but the advantage of its speed couldn't be denied. Yet even so, they were too late. A quick scan of the system revealed that the bulk of the Forsaken Sons fleet had already departed. Some Imperial commanders argued for immediate pursuit, but that course of action was quashed when the navigators of the entire fleet categorically refused to give chase. The warp, they explained, had been thrown into complete disarray behind the Forsaken Sons flagship, a deliberate attempt to stop them from following their trail through the Sea of Souls. Merely entering the Empyrean again before it had settled down would be dangerous, trying to pursue the Hand of Ruin would be suicidal. The leaders of the unlikely alliances of humans and Eldar, those few souls trusted enough to know the Forsaken Sons' intent, recognized what the Hand of Ruin's departure meant. The Forsaken Sons had found what they needed on Neril, and left part of their force behind to stop others from finding it too. Why they hadn't destroyed the clues to the Nightmare Fleet's location wasn't clear, but there was half a dozen possible explanations. They didn't have the time, they couldn't destroy it, they didn't know for sure if what they found was the only source of that knowledge on the planet. Regardless, with the Chaos Forces already in control of the Archive of Loss, the initial plan to sneak a team onto the surface to recover the information had to be amended. Besides, both allied factions were eager to engage the enemy at Neril, the Imperials because they had already suffered too many losses, the Elders because they recognized the taint of their ancient enemy upon those who had been left to guard the cemetery world. Within hours of the Allies' arrival, they engaged the Chaos Fleet in orbit above Neril. The traitor warships were twisted things of metal and mutated flesh, armed with strange heretic weaponry. They matched the Allied fleet in numbers, which meant neither side could hope to claim orbital supremacy swiftly. The two fleets engaged in battle, the attackers clearing sections for the troops they carried to begin the descent toward the surface. Hundreds of tombstones and monuments crumbled to pieces to make way for the landing crafts of the Imperium. Many more would be destroyed before this was over, but it was a lesser desecration compared to the ongoing presence of the Forsaken Sons army. Meanwhile, the forces of Myantor deployed using mysterious means that didn't show on the Imperial auspexes, the children of Aisha returning to Neril for the first time since long before the fall of their own empire. Only the barest attempt at coordination was made between Eldar and Imperials, the two landing on opposite side of their target, so that there wouldn't be any interference or not-so-friendly fire. And so, as the skies of Neril burned, the Imperial and Eldar forces began their advance toward the enemy camp. Raguel Alastors went to war for the first time since his rebirth, and found that it brought him neither joy nor comfort. The lumbering shape of his dreadnought chassis marched in the wake of his brothers, who were charging straight into the fray, forming the spear point of the Imperial onslaught. Imperial guardsmen came behind them, running to keep pace with the heirs as best they could. The Inquisition had recovered a handful of Astra Militarum units from the rest of the Azeroth sector, bolstering their numbers. Squads of elite stormtroopers were mixed with the thousands of guardsmen, serving to reinforce their will to fight. Like the Imperial Navy ships, the guardsmen had been taken from battle zones where hundreds of their comrades had perished, and their morale had been shaky at best. Commissars and preachers were doing their best to rouse the guardsmen's fury, pointing out the desecration of the sacred land around them by the foul traitors. All around them stretched the graves of Neril. From a tactical perspective, the environment wasn't that different from urban combat, although if an imperial city had been built so inefficiently, the Arbits would have shot those responsible. Visibility was blocked by towering monuments, and the paths that sneaked between the rows of graves for the Nerolite caretakers were entirely unsuitable for the Imperium's advance. As a result, the heirs of Sanguinius were leaving a trail of crushed stone in their wake, charging right through the monuments like ceramite-clad battering rams. The damage they were inflicting to this sacred place was regrettable, but unavoidable. Once the Forsaken Sons' foul minions had been crushed by the hammer of Imperial retribution, they would make sure to repair and resanctify these graves. The best Imperial architects and servitor crews would rebuild this world once it had been freed of taint, and the priests of the Ecclesiarchy would reconsecrate it. That wouldn't be Raguel's responsibility to organize, however. As a dreadnought, he couldn't be the chapter master of the heirs of Sanguinius anymore. Such was prescribed in the Codex Astartes, and for very good reasons. When this war was over, there would be a conclave of the surviving heirs, few as they now were, and a new leader would be chosen from among them, while Raguel would join the chapter's ancients, if he survived, of course. But that was for later. Right now, at last, was the hour of retribution. The hour of battle, after months spent teetering on the brink of death, even after Lord Inquisitor Ackerman had dragged him back to the land of the living with his strange device. Those heirs of Sanguinius who had survived the disaster at Silberstadt had been recalled to participate in this battle, and the ones that would follow in order to prevent the Forsaken Sons' mad plan to reach fruition. Not all of the chapter's surviving brothers had been able to make it, some had been delayed, stranded, or unwilling to abandon allies who desperately needed their help on other fronts of the Black Crusade. The fortress monastery of the heirs of Sanguinius had miraculously not come under attack by the Forsaken Sons, even though the traitors must surely know its location. Raguel suspected this was deliberate, as half a company were forced to stay there just in case, lest the precious stores of gene seed, armaments and lore that rested there were attacked in their absence, thus depleting the chapter's fighting forces without costing the traitors anything. Even so, over 300 heirs of Sanguinius were now marching together, around two-thirds of the chapter's remaining strength after the disastrous losses they had suffered so far in the Black Crusade. As the old saying went, such numbers could conquer star systems, but Raguel had painfully learned not to underestimate the Forsaken Sons and their servants. "You are approaching the heretic's position," said Captain Tyrion over the Vox, his words carried directly into Raguel's brain by the cybernetic augments that made him one with his chassis. According to Medell's report, there shouldn't be any outlying defenses. Captain Medell of the 10th Company had brought his scouts with him. They had landed ahead of the main force, serving their function as explorers and examining the enemy positions for weak spots. Meanwhile, Captain Tyrion was back in the fleet, collating the intelligence they gathered and coordinating the advance of the Imperial forces. The captain of the 5th Company had wanted to join the fight in person, but his wounds from Silberstadt had been so grievous they were still not fully healed, leading him to instead assume this position, where he could do the most good. "Are there still no reports of the Forsaken Sons?" asked Raguel. "No," replied Tyrion, his voice carrying the same frustration Raguel felt. "Only their slaves. Ever have the craven fled from Retribution's fire? So be it." With a thought, he shifted from a private vox link to his speakers, addressing the warriors around him. "We shall expunge these riches from this sacred world, before hunting down their vile masters, wherever they may hide." 300 heirs of Sanguinius roared their agreement, and the Battle of Nerul began. The heretics had had ample warning of the Imperials' approach. They may have been too busy with their depraved pursuits to build proper fortifications, but they had gathered to meet the Imperial assault. Any sane enemy would have flinched at the sight of the charging Space Marines, but these were the lost and the damned, who had long since abandoned sanity in exchange for the embrace of the ruinous powers. They countercharged the heirs of Sanguinius, throwing away their lives in the vain hope of stopping the Astartes, or at least slowing them down. Bolt shells and las beams flew all around Raguel's hulking form. Within seconds, dust clouds of dirt and stone kicked up by the battle choked the air, but his sensors easily pierced through, giving him a clearer image of the foe than anyone else. With his flamer, he incinerated cultists wearing gas masks and drug injectors. Whatever they were pumping into their bodies was making them fearless, and they rushed the dreadnought without hesitation, running over the charred corpses of their brethren. Raguel's audio sensors could pick up their muffled screams, but they spoke a distorted dialect of Low Gothic he had never encountered before, and he could only make out one word they were saying in 10. It was still enough to know that,
Whatever chemical stimulants were being pumped into their veins, they weren't designed to make the experience pleasant. Further ahead, mutilated humans clad only in loincloths were daubing canvas of stretched human skin with blood, excrement, and other disgusting substances with paintbrushes, their faces set in expressions of horrified ecstasy. As Ragwell and his brothers approached, the ignoble paintings rippled as if struck from behind, before tearing open and becoming gateways to the immaterium, leaking its corrupting madness into reality. Dozens of pale-skinned demons with purple claws and horns emerged, the firsts embracing the cultists before cutting them apart with languid grace. A pack of those demonettes swarmed Ragwell, climbing over his armored form and stabbing at him with their pincers. Alarms started to ring in his ears, but before his attackers could do too much damage, targeted shots picked the hellish creatures off him. "Thank you, brothers," said the dreadnought to the heirs who had come to his aid, before redirecting his fury upon the demons. Ragwell charged through the Neverborn, smashing them against his chassis until he reached the blasphemous portals, still disgorging more of them onto Neril. With his power claw, he ripped the grotesque fabric asunder. By destroying the material base for the warp portals, the hole between the materium and the immaterium was shut down. The demonettes converged on him to stop him from destroying all of the gateways the mad artists had created, but the other rares of Sanguinius struck them in the back, and within a few moments every warp gate had been sealed and every demon banished. The Space Marines resumed their advance, but there were still thousands more of cultists of sludge and other horrors, culled from all the damned worlds of the Wailing Storm by the Forsaken Sons. No, there would be no comfort to be found on this battlefield for Ragwell. But in the pursuit of duty, there was satisfaction, and that would be enough. Meanwhile, on the other side of the heretics' position, the host of Craftworld Myantor was going to war for the first time in over 2 centuries. The ships in orbit had brought with them the components required to build small webway gates, through which the Eldar forces had marched straight from the Craftworld. For many of them, this was their first ever real battle, as Myantor had successfully stayed away from the turmoil of the galaxy since its escape from the Fall, apart from the incident during the War of the Beast. Each wore the colors of the Craftworld, a pale gray with obsidian markings and a red faceplate. Autarch Irithiel watched from his customized command fire prism as his troops advanced toward the enemy position. Hundreds of aspect warriors had already passed through the gates, and there were many more still on Myantor. In the cycles since the bestial orcs had breached their sacred home, a greater portion of the Craftworld's population had joined the warrior paths, determined to prevent another such calamity from befalling their people. Each of the aspect shrines was represented, while squads of gravbikes flew ahead and heavier vehicles brought up the rear. Here was the might of Myantor at his command, yet Irithiel was bitterly aware that this host, for all its grandeur, was only a pale shadow of the greatness his people had once possessed. During the preparations for this war, the Autarch had delved into the Craftworld's archives to find all that was known of the Nightmare Fleet. His research, aided by the archivists and historians of Myantor, had revealed far more than Neril's importance. Since the Fall, the elders who had rejected the decadence of their kin had heavily censored what knowledge of their empire had survived the disaster. Irithiel could understand their motive. The birth of She Who Thirsts had clearly been a traumatic event for the children of Aisha, and escaping the maw of the Dark Goddess had been their sole objective. But in his eyes, they had gone too far in rejecting their roots. They had condemned their descendants to be little more than vagrants, their territory reduced to the Craftworlds, their technology and power crippled. The Assyriani had been on the decline since their very founding, and though it may take millennia, eventually they would all perish, and the only elders left would be the vile Drukhari and the irrelevant Exodites. To Irithiel, who had spent centuries on the path of command, this was unacceptable. For the longest time, he had believed there was nothing he could do about it, except fight with all his might to protect Myantor and enforce its isolation, so that the Craftworld might endure longer. Now, however, he had glimpsed a priceless opportunity. The prison of the Ryaway Noah held within it more than just the mistakes of the Monkey, it also held the lost secrets and relics of the Eldar Empire, along with the warriors who had ensured their race's dominion over the galaxy. Of course, Irithiel didn't intend to release the Nightmare Fleet just to also free his ancestors, such would have been the height of foolishness. But once the corrupted Monkey had been dealt with and the ignorant Imperials were content that the threat had been averted, the Autarch could return to the prison, and find a way to selectively release those imprisoned within the dimensional oubliette.
It would be difficult, likely the work of centuries, but even a partial success would give Myantor an incredible advantage in the pursuit of survival. And yes, his ancestors hadn't done it themselves, but then, by the time the Monkey had been able to leave their homeworld, Irithiel's people had already been far on their way to the fall. It was just as likely they just hadn't bothered to free their captive kinsman that they hadn't been able to. For now, he would keep these thoughts to himself. Tarak had already shown he could listen even on psychic communication, and he didn't want to risk the Monkey learning of his intent. For all that Myantor and the Imperium were currently allies, the Autarch was under no illusion as to how long that alliance would last once the threat of the Forsaken Sons was dealt with. Of course, all of his grand plans for the future would come to nothing if they couldn't find the Archive of Loss, which returned his full focus on the unfolding battle. At first, the elders encountered only the deluded worshippers of She Who Thirsts, and they were easily cut down by the vanguard, the swift riders running circles around the mutated Monkey. But as word of their presence spread among the Chaos forces, one particular element of the Slayer Ineshi horde rushed to meet the Craftworld's army. These were the creatures Tarak had told them about during their first meeting on Myantor. The resurrected souls of the most wretched of sinners, the very elders whose corruption had caused the fall. The Shailat, the children of Hell, who had ruled over the world called Paraxis during the centuries between the Fall and the Great Crusade, making playthings of the human colonists who had the misfortune of landing into their clutches. Back on the world the Monkey had called Paraxis, Tarak had known of two kinds of Shailat, their warriors and their flesh-crafting nobles, engineers of abomination and torment. Now the warriors of Myantor faced both, along with a horde of monsters. The Shailat were very few, but with them came a horde of gene-forged horrors, each crafted by the gene lords from the clay of human genetics and diabolical inspiration. Blind, mewling masses of muscles fitted with pain collars that only abated their torment when they killed their master's enemies, six-limbed pale figures with distended jaws that crawled across the battlefield with inhuman speed, screeching furies flying on membranous wings. These were but a sample of the menagerie of nightmares the Shailat had bred in their city of screams, now unleashed upon the descendants of their more honorable cousins. The sight of it all was viler than Irithiel's path-bound mind could ever have imagined possible, which was the point of the paths in the first place. Even from aboard his fire prism, the psychic miasma of the Shailat and their creations made the Autarch feel sick. Was this what all our ancestors were like? He thought, and the idea filled him with dread. But no. Surely not. If the entire Eldar Empire had been in the Shailat's image, society would have collapsed long before the fall, and not a single craft world would have been constructed. No, just like Irithiel's forebears had completely rejected their roots out of fear of the decadence poisoning them, the Shailat were the greatest deviants, the worst monsters spawned by the Elders during their eons long reign over the galaxy. The thought was poor consolation, however, when confronted with such a display of corruption. Was this what the Monkey felt when facing their chaos-worshipping kin? If so, Irithiel may have to revise his view of their inquisitorial allies, who faced such things constantly. As the vanguard of gravbikes reeled from this psychic malaise, the Shailat struck. Tentacled horrors tore pilots from their seats and hurled them to the ground, slamming them against the broken stones of Monkey graves with enough strength to shatter their bones. There, the rest of the Gene Lord's menagerie descended upon them, tearing them apart with horrendous screams. Within seconds, nearly the entire vanguard had been wiped out, with only a few managing to escape in time. Once the initial shock passed, however, Myantor's warriors were filled with righteous fury, and not just at the sight of their fallen comrades. The very existence of the Shailat went against every ideal the paths stood for, and the aspect warriors threw themselves in the fray with a determination that bordered on madness. In the name of Assyrian, Irithiel shouted, his words carried to every warrior of the host, "My brethren, kill these abominations." Irithiel yearned to join the fray himself, to draw his blade and fight against these vile reflections of his people's glory. But he couldn't. He was the only full-fledged Autarch of Myantor, the only soul who had any experience on the path of command. The Autarch Council had been decimated during the War of the Beast and hadn't recovered yet. It took much longer than 200 cycles to train a new Autarch, and few souls were ever called to that path. And with the Council of Seers still recovering from their disastrous divination attempt, the burden of leadership in this campaign had largely fallen on his shoulders. His life didn't belong to him but to the craft world,
and he couldn't risk him, no matter how much it galled him to send others in a battle he couldn't join. All he could do was fulfill his role as autarch and direct his troops. It quickly became apparent that the Shailat lacked any sort of coordination or leadership, each of them doing as they pleased with their cohort of abominations. Shailat warriors were surrounded by squads of howling banshees and attacked from all directions while dire avengers fired from afar, even their eldritch armor eventually giving way under repeated blows. Warp spiders moved among the horde of beasts, never staying in one location for more than a single heartbeat, and though many were still caught and slain, they left a trail of dead and bleeding monstrosities in their wake. The Genelords themselves were surrounded by scores of their most redoubtable creations, and clad in demon-inspired equipment that made them all but invulnerable to conventional weapons. To stop them, conclaves of warlocks pooled their energies to unleash devastating psychic workings, creating illusions that ensnared the feeble minds of the Shailat's creations, exposing their masters to focused fire from the engines of Vol in the backline. For a long moment, the battle hung on a knife's edge, then it became apparent to the autarch that they were winning. The sons and daughters of Myantor were overcoming the incarnation of their people's old sin. Irithiel let himself smile, and then the horizon darkened, as a new foe joined the fray. It was tall, taller than the orc walkers Irithiel had seen despoil the tranquil gardens of Myantor 200 cycles prior. A humanoid torso rose above six-bladed and segmented legs, covered in thick black chitin that seemed to have been carved into the shape of screaming faces. Glowing purple lines ran across its body, pulsating in time with the arrhythmic beating of an unseen heart. In one hand, it held a club covered in wicked barbs, while the other arm ended in a biological cannon. Worst of all was its face, which was sculpted into the aspect of an Eldar of obscene perfection and beauty, its smile making even the bravest warrior hesitate in fright. Its cannon took aim and fired, releasing shots of mixed plasma and warp fire, each obliterating entire squads of aspect warriors from existence, their spirit stones shattered by the blast and their spirits sent screaming to she who thirsts. Irithiel felt a shiver run down his spine as the goddess breathed out in exultation, having swallowed the souls of the children of Myantor that had been denied her for so long. He refused to let the terror overcome him, however, and instead channeled it through the lessons of the Path of Command, turning it into anger. With a scream of outrage, Irithiel commanded the engines of Vol to open fire on this new abomination. But when the smoke cleared, the six-legged biomechanical monstrosity still stood, seemingly unaffected by the full might of the host's heavy weaponry. It swooped down with its cub, catching a trio of aspect warriors and sending them flying, while two of its legs impaled howling banshees in the torso, the warriors still twitching as the limbs moved again to propel it forward. This was not a foe they could defeat with the weapons they had deployed thus far, the autarch realized as he gave the order for his forces to withdraw from the path of the Shailat walker. There was but one recourse if they were to triumph over their enemy. Irithiel had hoped to keep that particular asset in reserve, for tactical reasons as well as spiritual ones. But he couldn't hesitate now. It would take several minutes at best for the asset to make its way through the webway gates, and every moment that passed sentenced another denizen of Myantor to eternal torment. His voice thick with cold anger, he gave the order that would damn the soul of one of his comrades in arms. As the exarch of the Dire Avengers Temple replied with grim confirmation of the order's reception, Irithiel once again swore that he'd make all these sacrifices worth it. Azirathon laughed as he killed, safe inside the chest of his great war construct, floating inside a pocket of liquid, connected to his engine through cables made of living nerves and bone. The firstborn of the Shailat reveled in the easy slaughter of these pathetic echoes of the Eldar Empire, feeling a jolt of pleasure for every soul he sent to the dark goddess that owned his own. Every craft-world Eldar who perished had their soul hurled into the maw of Slanch, while the gates of the Silver Palace were open to welcome the Shailat who lost their bodies. There they would dwell in blessed excess, until they returned to the flesh on Paraxis, or aboard the dark ships the Shailat had directed their slaves to build. He took his time, determined to enjoy this rare opportunity. It had been centuries since he had killed his own kind, and no matter how weak the craft-worlders had become they were still elders. Once they had dealt with these fools and their imperial allies, perhaps they would hunt down the craft-world from whence they had come. What great reward would the goddess bestow upon them for such a sacrifice? What bliss, what agonies would she grant unto them as they defiled one of the last remnants of her defiant people? The ground shook, drawing his thoughts away from his contemplation. The air trembled.
Thoughts of bloodshed and wrath pressed against Ezirith's mind and filled those of his lesser kindred, driving them to frenzy while some of his brethren turned tail and fled, sensing the doom that approached long before it arrived. The host of Myantar parted to let a figure of blackened brass and lava pass, heading directly for Ezirith. For a moment, the firstborn thought he had gone mad, then he realized what had actually happened, which did little to diminish his disbelief. They had done it, Ezirith realized. The craft worlders had awakened the war god. The avatar of Cain was as tall as the firstborn's living engine, a towering shape of burning wrath and power. It was only a shard of Kala Mensha Cain, that ancient god the goddess had slain when she had first awakened, but even the shard of a god still held power beyond what mortals could conceive of. The wrath of the defeated gods still radiated from it, and the creations of Ezirith's colleagues fled from it, driven by instincts so deep even all the terrible things that had been done to them couldn't suppress them. But Ezirith was no mere mortal. He had witnessed the birth of Slunch, and served her for centuries, before dying and then being resurrected by another champion of the dark gods. He had witnessed the glories of the realms of chaos, and the sight of a fragment of a dead god would not scare him. He blocked the god shard's blow with his club, feeling the heat burn through the outer layers of the living weapon's skin. The club's intellect was a small and stunted thing, it hardly needed more than that to fulfill its function, but even it felt fear now. Ezirith raised his other arm and fired point blank into the avatar's perpetually snarling face, bathing it in hellish fire. The meeting of two opposite energies caused a violent detonation that forced the two giants apart, as well as sending every troop in the vicinity to the ground. Then a fist-shaped meteor slammed into his torso's lower half. The flames dissipated, revealing the face of Cain, damaged but alive. The god shard punched him again, cracking his armor and forcing him to stumble backward a few steps. The firstborn's mind was full of the pain of his engine, but his will was strong enough to fight through it. He lashed out with his club, only for the avatar to catch the weapon mid-swing with its free hand. Lava-like ichor dripped as the club's barbs bit into burning flesh, melting the broken stone where it landed. In the same moment, the avatar raised its blade, placing the tip on the crack its fist had left in Ezirith's armor, and pushed. There was resistance, even damaged. His armor was strong, as evidenced by the fact none of the elders' other weapons had breached it. But this blade held the might of a dead god's wrath, given form by the sacrifice of an exalted soul to the hungry, hateful fires of the war-given form. It broke through and plunged all the way to the hilt, bursting out of the construct's back. No, Ezirith panicked. No, 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 no. This couldn't be. Not like this. Not after everything he had. There was fire, and pain that brought no pleasure as the flames of a god the Gene Lord had betrayed devoured his physical form. His blackened soul screamed, searching for a purchase in the materium, a way to stay alive. As death approached, it lifted the veils his own mind had placed upon his post-mortem memories to protect itself, and the remembrance of what waited for him made him even more desperate to avoid going back. In the final moments of his existence, Ezirith remembered that the Maw of Slunch and the gates of the Silver Palace were one of the same, and that all Eldar souls were treated the same by the Dark Prince of Chaos in the end. But there wasn't anything he could do, and he finally fell from life and into the warp's burning tides. Orpheus breathed in the war-stained air of Neril, savoring the mix of old dust and fresh blood. It was a unique and potent melange, and one the chosen of Akan reveled in like a fine wine. This world had brought him many new experiences since he had come here. The sorcerer of Slunch stood alone. Unlike most of the coven, he had never used acolytes to assist him in his work, finding that doing so diluted the pleasure that came from manipulating the raw stuff of the warp and bending it to his will. The few cultists of the youngest god who weren't throwing themselves at the foe stayed clear of him, preparing the final defenses for the enemy assault while calling for the Dark Prince to look upon their works and welcome them into his embrace as they gave their lives to the cause of the Forsaken Sons. A worthy endeavor, but futile. If the enemy armies reached them, then the battle was already lost. The position they occupied, the one Archon had ordered them to hold, was hardly defensible. It was one of 10,000 memorials, standing atop an entrance to the catacombs below Neril's surface. Orpheus hadn't even bothered to have the other former Emperor's children and other Slayer Ineshi Chaos Marines stand with him. Instead, they had stayed in orbit, to try their hand at boarding the ships of the Elders while their main force was on the ground. He had only kept a handful with him, to serve as his personal guard as well as witnesses of what he was about to do. Meanwhile, Mikhail had gone down below, to try and destroy the clues Archon had found so that no one else could use them. Orpheus doubted he would succeed. If it were so easy, doubtless Archon would have destroyed them himself. But perhaps the gods would smile upon the other chosen, as they had many times before. It wasn't exactly common, after all, for a renegade imperial trooper to rise to the heights of power Mikhail had achieved. The man had come very far since Paraxis, and wore the favor of the Dark Prince openly. Orpheus' enhanced senses were already starting to pick out the noise of the enemy, still several kilometers distant. He could feel the powerful souls approaching, the bright spirits of a few space marine librarians, and the delicious souls of the elders. As Erythn's death, and the summoning of the avatar of Cain, had drawn the gaze of the Dark Prince to this battlefield. The sorcerer of Sludge shivered in pleasure under his deity's attention, as well as in anticipation of what he was about to do. From the moment Archon had told him what was expected of him, the sorcerer had barely been able to contain himself. The Awakened One had known Orpheus' talents made him uniquely suited to this particular battlefield, and he wouldn't disappoint his lord, not when he had provided him such an exquisite opportunity. Slowly, he extended his will downward, past the confines of his flesh and into the earth of Nerul. The temperature around him dropped, crystals of ice forming on defiled gravestones as he drew upon the energies of the Empyrean, letting them flow through him, sharpening his psychic senses as he looked for. And there it was, just beneath the surface of all these boring prayers and funereal rites. A depthless reservoir of terror, pain and hatred, drawn from all the horrible ways in which an entire subsector's worth of people could die. The graveyard had earned that name in blood, spilled at the edge of orcish blades. There was so much of it. The orcs of the Great Beast had slaughtered billions in Azeroth alone before being defeated, and many more in the rest of the galaxy, in a genocide of such scale it rivaled the heresy. Orpheus tasted the terror of the dead, and drew upon that reservoir, becoming a conduit between it and the warp. "Greetings, little ghosts," he whispered as the very power of the gods passed through him and into the graves of Nerul. "I am afraid your nightmares are not yet over, for I have a use for them." Through Orpheus, the power of the warp gave form to the tormented memories of the dead. Silhouettes began to emerge from the shadows of the graves, tall and simian, with small red eyes and two wide maws. Orcs. Orpheus had summoned an army of spectral greenskins, giving false life to the nightmarish last memories of the dead of the graveyard. The chosen of Archon laughed as his creations began to run outward, to where the Eldar and Imperial forces were closing in on the memorial. They were not demons, not really, but close enough that it made little difference from a tactical perspective. The Allied forces quickly overcame the surprise of seeing translucent orcs before them, especially once the first ranks were torn to bloody pieces. As was the case with Manifested Neverborn, their weapons still worked on the specters, but there were just too many of them. Even the avatar of Cain was stopped, unable to advance as a sea of ghostly orcs swarmed it. It cut swathes of them down with each swipe of its blade, and their own weapons and claws could do little harm to the divine fire that burned inside it, but it couldn't advance either. The ghostly orcs couldn't get too far from Orpheus without starting to lose their substance, not that they paid any heed to that. The echoes of the Xenos brutes were far too bloodthirsty to let a little thing like dissolution stop them. Fortunately, more continued to appear as they faded away. Even the thousands Orpheus had brought into existence were but a drop in the ocean of memories that dwelled on Nerul. Their foes were too disciplined to break, even when faced with such a seemingly limitless enemy, but they did retreat in good order, holding the line right at the edge of where the orcs started to dissolve too much to fight properly. No doubt their leaders were already considering their options and preparing a plan, though Orpheus was hoping this setback would throw a wrench in the relations between the Imperials and the Eldar. Unless the Imperium had changed a lot in the Forsaken Sun's absence, that tie must be tense already, and if it could be broken, this might turn from a holding operation into a true victory. For now, he would remain here. He had come prepared and rested. He could maintain the summoning spell for days easily, and weeks with a little aid to keep his body nourished. Far above the battlefield where the living fought the dead, aboard the ship Judgment's Will, Elaidios Ackerman stood with his eyes closed. His mind was empty of all thoughts save that of the spell he was about to perform, his mental voice repeating the mantras that set his psyche in the correct pattern. Absolute concentration was required, for the slightest lapse could and would result in a painful and ignominious death. In his hands, he held a long staff of adamantium laced wood topped by a beautiful sculpture of an Aquila holding the Inquisition's emblem in its claws. It was a focus of power, but not like the staves employed by librarians of the Adeptus Astartes and sanctioned psychers of the Scholus Icana. Elydios, for all his lore, was no psyker. He held no power within him, forever threatening to burst forth from his flesh and damn his soul. His fellow inquisitors had many words for what he was, none of which were flattering. Witch, warlock, spellslinger, ritualist, heretic, radical, along with many other cruder appellations. The members of the Ordo were not above petty insults when their tempers were raised. If not for his continued successes in the struggle against the infernal minions of the ruinous powers, he might have ended up burned at the stake by his peers for wielding secrets they considered too dangerous for anyone to wield. Even success wouldn't have protected him from the doubts of his Puritan brethren forever. But he was Lord Inquisitor now, leader of the Azeroth Conclave, even if that rank had only been bestowed upon him out of desperation after the Conclave had been decimated by the betrayal of Gaeli's servitors and the sudden strike of the sorcerer Lord Arsum and his Xenos ally Carthago. His forbidden secrets had been the only thing that had kept the slaughter of the Conclave from being total, and with the influx of demonic activity across Azeroth that had accompanied the Black Crusade, leadership from one of the Ordo Malleus was sorely needed. He had led the survivors of the Conclave to Cardinal Station, had returned the chapter master of the heirs of Sanguinius from the dead and learned from him the name and face of their foe. He had directed the resistance to the Forsaken Sons and their slaves, and made alliance with the elders of Craftworld Myantor when they had come to bring warning of the Nightmare Fleet. He would not fail now. The chamber had been cleared at his order weeks ago, just after the Inquisitorial flotilla had left Cardinal Station. He hadn't known for sure they would need it, but there was no such thing as being over-prepared when one was an inquisitor. Candles made from the corpses of priests who had died peacefully after spending their lifetimes in contemplation of the Emperor's glory were the only source of illumination. They lit up a complex circle drawn in chalk mixed with Elidio's own blood and the ashes of dismal texts recovered from the workshops of the madman who had brought the Child of Anarchy into the Materium, several years before the mark of the Forsaken Sons began to spread across Azeroth. Even now, some trace of the cultist's insane genius lingered within the ashes, lending their power to what the Lord Inquisitor was about to attempt. Only 3 other people stood in the room with him, though 10 souls in total occupied it. To his left was Alphon, who had first put forward his name as Lord Inquisitor, and who knew things even Elydios didn't. Like Elydios, the Inquisitor wore a suit of human-sized power armor, and carried a power sword and a bolter an unaugmented man would have struggled to lift, with various other tools hanging from his belt. The ornate war gear made for a stark contrast with its wielder, who was, in all aspects, an utterly unremarkable man, an image the other Inquisitor had gone to great lengths to cultivate. Alphon was usually more comfortable hunting down the intrigues that took place in the halls of power, but the time for subtlety had passed, and his face was set in a determined expression. Next to him was Alethria Minius, the only Xenos in the room, not that her people had been happy about letting her come alone. The Farseer was clad in her panoply of war, her ornate armor covering her from head to toe while she held a bladed staff in her hands and a shuriken pistol hang from her waist. She had glanced at his preparations and given a single nod, high praise, coming from one of the arrogant Eldar. In truth, Elydios suspected she had no idea what he was doing. She was a psyker after all, and her skills ran in a different direction from his. Still, one never knew with the elders. Finally, completing the circle to Elydios' right was the being who called himself Tarek, despite having little left in common with the sea captain who had once borne that name. Power blazed from the 6 soulstones fused to his arm and soul by the trials they had undergone together. He wore no power armor, having never been trained in its use, but a suit of simple combat fatigues and flak armor, the kind worn by Imperial guardsmen across the entire Imperium, with a chainsword and las pistol hanging at his belt. Tarek didn't need those weapons to be dangerous, but it was always best to have options, and keep the eldritch power at his disposal in reserve for desperate situations. Elydios would have liked to have more people here. Inquisitor Sylviana had to stay behind to direct the war effort and provide an Inquisitor's perspective, but he would have loved to take a squad or 2 of stormtroopers or heirs of Sanguinius. Hells, he would have liked to have an entire army, or better yet a troop of Grey Knights, but the Knights hadn't arrived yet, and the spell he was going to use had limitations. Limitations that, in truth, he was already stretching by including Tarek, but not bringing him along would have been foolish. His destiny was entwined with that of the Forsaken Sons, and his power was beyond doubt, even if he had yet to demonstrate it in Elidio's presence. The battle on the surface had been going well, until the Forsaken Sons had unleashed the ghosts of Neril upon them. Now it was all the combined forces of the Imperium and Myantor could do to keep the spectral orcs from overwhelming their positions. Eventually the ghosts would fade away. No sorcerer could maintain such a working forever, especially since their divinations had revealed this was the work of a single heretic. But every day, every hour lost brought Arkan one step closer to victory. They needed to act now, to break the foe on Neril and gain access to the secrets hidden there that led to the Nightmare Fleet's location. Which was why they were here, with Elidios about to transport them directly into the catacombs leading to the Archive of Loss, under the center of the traitor's position on Neril. It would be dangerous, difficult, and potentially damning. But when had that ever stopped a true member of the Holy Ordosh? Elidios finally spoke aloud, the words burning his brain, bending his own mind in patterns no human thought should ever take. The candles flared and guttered out, reality twisted in on itself, and then they were gone. Azarok Sector, Cemetery World Neril. 745.M32. The four materialized deep beneath the surface of Neril. In some ways, the transition from the Judgment's world to the underground was instantaneous. In others, it felt like an eternity had passed, and it took all four of them several moments to recover, to shake off the physical discomfort, and to remember who they were and what their purpose was. None of them, not even Elithria Minius the Farseer or Tarek, with the souls of 6 ancient Eldar Psychers fused with his own, remembered what had or hadn't transpired during the transition. Perhaps their minds had simply refused to process it. "Let's go," said Inquisitor Lord Elidios Ackerman, once he no longer felt as if his heart was trying to leap out of his throat. With her staff glowing to light the way, the Farseer took the lead, guiding them through the labyrinth of bones. There were no maps of the catacombs. Maybe the Nerilites had some, but if so, they had been lost to the Forsaken Sons' attack. The Farseer had her own knowledge of their destination's location, however, and her psychic gifts allowed her to see the way they must walk in order to reach it. They passed walls of skulls, carefully arranged and tended to by generations of priests and caretakers. They saw traces of damage where the Forsaken Sons had passed, shrines to the God Emperor torn down, broken bones, disrupted pillars and altars. There were no sign of desecration, however, and even this damage felt accidental, the product of transhuman warriors in full armor rushing through this place rather than deliberate insult. They also found a few fresher bodies, the corpses of the Nerilite priests, left to rot where they had fallen, most reduced to pulp by the thread of armored boots. "They were in a hurry," said Alphon. "Yes," agreed Elidios. "They must have known we were coming." "But how?" wondered the other Inquisitor. Yes, that was the question, wasn't it? How had Arkan known the Imperium had any idea of his true plans? The madman had set the entire sector ablaze, scattered an army that rivaled those of the Despoiler's own Black Crusades, all as a smokescreen for his real objective, the unleashing of the Nightmare Fleet. And yet, despite all this, he had still acted as if they were on his heels, as if being caught before his plan reached fruition would spell failure. Even if he had known of the allied Imperial and Eldar fleets approaching Neril, why hadn't he stayed and fought? Judging by the disturbance in the ether the departing ships had caused, the void engagement would have been decisively in his favor, especially once Astartes' boarding parties came into play. What game was the awakened one playing? Soon, they arrived at the threshold. It wasn't a smooth transition. The Forsaken Sons had forced their way in, blasting away the deepest Imperial crypts to open a path to the Eldar complex beneath. They had used heavy explosives, the kind used to breach fortresses, in order to tear open a hole into the wall, digging diagonally down until they reached the open space that had been hidden deeper. How they had known where to dig was unclear, presumably the same way they had known to come to Neril in the first place. The idea that the Chaos Gods were giving information directly to Arkan was disturbing, but it fit with the Chaos Lord's actions throughout the Black Crusade. The breached tunnel led to a sudden drop into darkness. They climbed down a ladder of rope the heretics had left behind, and descended into the Archive of Loss. It was incredible. Despite the urgency of their mission, despite the threat that loomed over the horizon, Elidios couldn't help but be awed at what the ancient elders had made here. The architecture of the monument was completely different from the descriptions of craft worlds Elidios had read. Modern Eldar architecture was as strange as it was beautiful, but it was still of a scope and kind the human mind could comprehend, much as the Elders themselves may scoff at the idea. This, however, had been built by the Xenos at the height of their power, and the alien nature of their thoughts was on full display. It brought to Elidio's mind a theory he had once read, claiming that the Elders who had survived the fall had, in the process, become much closer to the other races of the galaxy, as opposed to the Fae, eldritch creatures they had been when the galaxy had been their playground. There wasn't much evidence for or against that theory. Even the Elders themselves had forgotten much of their pre-fall history, and those ancient monsters in Camorra who actually remembered the days of the Empire could not be trusted for anything, least of all giving accurate accounts of the past. The walls of the Archive of Loss were curved and the floor impossible smooth, all of it made of the same, pure white material, with no visible junction, as if it had all been carved from one enormous piece. Alien runes covered the walls, glowing like jewels. No, he realized, they were jewels, each cut in the shape of an Eldar rune. His knowledge of Eldar languages was spotty at best, and this was a dialect that had been old when the Emperor had risen on Terra, but he could tell the runes formed names. Thousands and thousands of names, a memorial to all those who had been lost to imprison the Nightmare Fleet. Elidios opened his mouth to comment on their surroundings, but no sound came out. Startled, he realized that at some point in their advance, all noise had stopped. Plus this is a place dedicated to the dead, plus whispered a voice inside his skull. Plus my ancestors made sure that they wouldn't be disturbed, even as their descendants came to pay their respects. Plus. The Farseer, Elidios realized with a start. She was speaking inside his mind using her psychic abilities. This was hardly his first time being addressed like this, but he still instinctively recoiled at the alienness of her mind touching him, keeping his face from twisting in disgust through an effort of will. He couldn't afford to anger her, not here, not now. Plus she continued, either not noticing his discomfort or choosing to ignore it. Plus we must hurry. There is something powerful down here, something that seeks to destroy what we came here to find. Plus. Ominous. Elidios would have asked for more details if he could speak, but suspected the Farseer truly didn't know anything else. For all their pretensions of omniscience, the Elders of Myantor had been caught by the Black Crusade just as unaware as the Imperium. Though the battle above had drawn the heretics to the surface, the catacombs weren't completely empty. As the party turned at an angle in the path, they encountered a band of cultists busy defacing a series of 20 meters high statues Elidios was almost certain were representations of the dead Eldar pantheon. The cultists' equipment was a mix of primitive metalwork and modern weaponry. They were clad in armor of brass and silver, and wielded wickedly curved blades alongside a mix of laser and solid projectile weapons. Mutation was rife among them, their flesh twisted by the cursed gifts of their dark patron, sensory organs were bloated, patches of skin were covered in scales or fur, or both, elongated tongues hung from open maws full of pointed teeth. Plus we won't be able to cross the room without them noticing, plus said the silent voice, not of Elithria, but of Tarek, surprising Elidios, though the Inquisitor Lord realized he shouldn't be, given the man's condition. Plus we need to kill them. Plus yes, plus replied Elithria, her mental voice carrying a hint of the anger she must feel at the sight of such defilement. Plus we must. Plus. Neither Elidios nor Alphon had any objection to the killing of heretics, of course, not that they would have been able to voice them if they did. They caught the cultists completely by surprise. This far behind their lines, they hadn't thought to leave a sentry, and with all sounds suppressed, stealth was obscenely easy. The four of them charged in, opening fire with their ranged weapons as they did so. Elidios' first shot took a cultist in the head, while his second hit another in the shoulder, from a bolter. Both were instantly fatal. Then they were in melee, with the heretics finally noticing them. The complete silence gave the fight a surreal effect, and Elidios was forced to focus even more than he usually would during combat in order to compensate for the disruption to his instincts. He also couldn't use his esoteric abilities, which required vocalization to manifest. Instead, he relied on his martial training. He had learned to use a staff as a melee weapon years ago, taught by a minor sect of warrior monks of the ecclesiarchy who had chosen it as their weapon of choice. According to their doctrine, the first weapon man had ever used was a length of wood, and so, by wielding a staff, a warrior honored the entire species from which they hailed. It was an unorthodox interpretation of some of the Imperial Creed's most obscure verses to be sure, but their prowess with the lengths of polished wood they used for training had been unquestionable. With his strength enhanced by the power armor he wore and his staff crackling with the energy of the field generator attached to its top, the lethality of the monk's precepts was multiplied. Bones shattered with his every blow, and he easily parried the cultists' return strikes, while his armor absorbed their fire easily. Next to him, Alphon fought with his power sword held in both hands, cutting down heretics with ruthless efficiency. It was the first time Elidios saw his colleague fight outside of the training chambers, and he was a shining example of what an unaugmented human was capable of, given the right training and tools. Meanwhile, the Farseer seemed to dance among the cultists, so gracious were her movements. Her bladed staff cut through their armor with ease, slicing metal and flesh in smooth motions. The heretics were focused on her, their debased souls sensing the favor their dark god would bestow upon them for slaying one of her kind, but they couldn't touch her. Of course, the outcome had never been in doubt. They were all trained fighters, with Tarek especially being impressive to watch. The empowered human was surrounded by a corona of psychic light, and moved with incredible speed, dodging every blow aimed at him and striking back with perfect precision. His every attack was lethal, crushing skulls and breaking necks, or piercing throats and hearts with his roaring chainsword, adamantium-tipped teeth tearing through the heretic's armor like paper. The soul stones embedded in the flesh of his arm shone through the flak armor he wore, a constant reminder of the alien origin of that prowess. Within less than a minute, the four of them had slain the last of the 30-odd cultists, and they were barely even winded. They left the corpses behind and resumed their advance. The Archive of Loss was vast, a network of criss-crossing avenues similar to the one they had come down into, all of them covered in the names of the dead. According to Elethria's earlier briefing, the monument containing the information they sought should be at the Archives Center, where the greatest heroes of the Eldar were honored. The deeper in they went, the more Elidios began to feel the power Elethria had mentioned waited for them at their destination. "Plus we are being hunted, plus," said the Farseer silently. Alphon raised his hand and pointed at himself, then at the way they had come from. "Plus you'll stay behind and deal with it?" Plus asked the Eldar. "Plus are you sure? It is a powerful slave of chaos that approaches. Plus." Alphon nodded, his expression grim but confident. "Plus very well, plus," sent Tarek, surprising Elidios with how quickly he agreed. "Plus be cautious. I recognize this presence, the dark gods once sent it after me, before I was what I am. Plus." That reveal nearly made Elidios stop Alphon, but he reconsidered. If Alphon thought he could do this, then the Lord Inquisitor must trust him. They couldn't risk being ambushed while confronting the power they could sense deeper in the complex. With one last nod to his friend, Elidios turned back to follow Elethria. The sheer amount of death in the catacombs had thinned the veil between materium and immaterium. For decades, the constant rituals and prayers of the Neralites had kept the Neverborn from taking advantage, but now the Neralite death priests were dead. With the battle above having drawn the eyes of the ruinous powers to this world, all the conditions were fulfilled for an old friend of the Forsaken Sons to return. Reality screamed and was torn asunder as the dark powers finally broke through the wards of the Anathema's servants. Near the entrance to the Archive of Loss, for even all the desecrations performed by their followers couldn't yet breach the pre-fall sorcery protecting the archive itself, a rift opened, but no demonic horde was unleashed upon the catacombs. Instead, a single figure stepped through the opening into hell, which closed behind it. The figure was no demon, though it would be difficult to tell when looking upon him. His body was made of living darkness hung around the bones of a space marine. His face was a skull within which lay two unblinking eyes that were unmistakably made of flesh despite being completely black. His right arm ended in a vicious blade, the only part of him apart from his exposed skull that was completely solid, and which crackled with sorcerous lightning. His left arm was grotesquely extended, ending in a claw of shadow that reached the height of his knees. He was, or had been, Zal Korak. Once, he had been a space marine of the 8th Legion, a son of the Night Haunter and a monster that paid lip service to the principles of the Great Crusade. Then he had been a Forsaken Son, throwing in his lot with Archon, not for glory or revenge, but the opportunity to continue to inflict pain upon the weak. But he had made a mistake. On Paraxis, he had made promises to the ruinous powers and failed to deliver upon them, which had resulted in him being dragged into the warp. He had been released and given another chance to pay back what he owed, only to be thwarted again as his quarry slipped away from him and he was recalled to the infernal realms. He had suffered there, more so than any of his many victims ever had at his hands. Not because the warp had any care for justice or karma, but because it had amused his demonic creditors to do so. His mind had been broken, stripped of its thin veneer of civilization to reveal the beast that laid underneath. Now he had been let loose once more, dragged away from the games of the Neverborn to play his part in the schemes of his former lord. For the shadow of Arkan in the warp was growing stronger with every step the awakened one took on the path to glory, and the dark god smiled upon his goal. He sniffed, tasting the air through senses that only vaguely resembled the ones he had once possessed. The realms of chaos had wrought a potent alchemy upon Zal Korak, remaking him body, mind and soul into a paramount hunter. The only release he had known from the torments inflicted upon him had been when they had set him to hunt down some wretched demon or damned soul in the formless wastes, those sections of the Empyrean unaligned with any of the four. This was the first time since Paraxis that he had been let loose upon the Materium, a third and last chance to prove his worth to his masters. He would never be free of the debt he owed. Too much interest had been accrued, too many gifts had been bestowed upon him against his will. But if he could do this, if he could deliver the sevenfold soul of his prey to the ruinous powers, his leash would be lengthened. He would be allowed to remain in the Materium, to rejoin with the Warband and serve Arkan as a shadowy killer, the souls of his victims sent to the realms of chaos in his stead, not too dissimilar to how the Drukhari sustained their own existences despite the hooks Slanch had in their souls. He knew who he hunted. He had hunted him once before, only to be cheated of his kill at the last moment. Now he could feel his presence, smell the lingering traces of his aura in the catacombs. Tarek of Paraxis was here. This time, he wouldn't escape. Zal Korak ran through the bones-filled tunnels, guided by preternatural senses. When he reached the hole his former brethren had dug, he leapt all the way down, landing on all four and continuing to run that way. He barely noticed the silent shroud that covered the area, and gave no attention to the ancient Eldar wonders all around him. These things didn't matter compared to the hunt, to the one chance of escaping his torments. The former Night Lord, who was more beast than Astartes at this point, finally came to a stop. A figure stood before him. A man, just a man, clad in power armor and holding a power sword and a bolt pistol. It was not his prey, but his soul was a powerful one, full of secrets almost to bursting. Zal Korak would have smiled if he could. Acidic drool dripped between his teeth, sizzling on the floor but failing to mark it. This would make for a lovely appetizer. The further into the archive they went, the more elaborate the decor became. The honored dead were commemorated with statues and hyper-detailed frescoes showing the bridges of Eldar starships, so realistic it felt to Elidios as if they could walk through the walls and into the distant past. Even as he ran as fast as he could, aided by his power armor's servo motors, Elidios took note of everything he saw, knowing that this was the kind of opportunity his peers and the Ordo Xenos would kill for, and that, likely as not, the archive would be gone or sealed by the time the Black Crusade was over. He doubted the Mayan Tor elders would tolerate leaving it accessible to the Imperium. More than 10 minutes after Alphon had stayed behind, the three remaining allies finally arrived at their destination. The corridor they had been running down had brought them to a vast domed chamber, the ceiling showing a scene of the naked void, with stylized constellations drawn between stars. Perhaps it depicted the heavens as seen on the Eldar's mythical homeworld, though there was no way to know. That world was no doubt burning in the eye of terror, making calculating its position from this snapshot impossible. The floor of the room raised at its center into an altar of sorts, atop which laid a pile of broken stone. Elidios gasped at the sight, and realized that he had heard himself gasp. Sound wasn't cancelled in this room, likely due to whatever had destroyed the steel at the center. Two figures stood before the broken pieces. Veiled creatures crawled around them, their feminine bodies clad in drags that had once been the sort of priceless clothes only the nobility of imperial worlds could afford. In a single glance, Elidios took in the appearance of these new foes. One of them appeared to be human, and would have been handsome, if not for the expression of his face, a mix of cruelty and viciousness. His body was muscular without the inhuman bulk that resulted from gene forging, his pale skin covered only by black leather pants and a sleeveless vest. His purple eyes burned with inner light, and on his brow rested a golden crown set with jewels that didn't quite fit his head.
A sword hung from his waist, inscribed with fell chaos runes. His long, flowing white hair was matted with sweat, and he was breathing heavily, but this did nothing to diminish the aura of threat he exuded. But it was his right hand that most drew the eye. It was an augmetic device of black metal, clashing against the rest of his unblemished flesh. A red jewel was embedded inside the palm, glowing with a fell illumination that set Elidio's teeth on edge. Black tendrils rose from where flesh met metal, covering most of his forearm and stretching above the elbow. Drops of blood fell from the highest tendrils, giving the impression they were newly grown, though the wearer didn't appear troubled by the pain he must surely be feeling from it. To his left was a creature Elidio's struggled to describe. It looked like a cross between a spider and an eldar, with a dash of demon thrown into the mix. It had 6 eyes, glowing with the same warp fire as the man next to it. Its withered body was implanted with many pieces of Xenos tech, the purpose of which Elidio's could only speculate about. It carried no obvious weapons, but Elidio's trained senses immediately identified it as some manner of psyker. His hatred of heretics was the fruit of years of indoctrination and witnessing the atrocities they were capable of in the field, but the spider thing inspired a deeper, atavistic hatred, the instinctive disgust all humans felt when faced with something that was so clearly, undeniably other. Shailat, he realized. One of the corrupt elders Tarek had warned them the Forsaken Sons had resurrected in the Wailing Storm. The two enemies of humanity were looking at the trio, smiling smiles that revealed pointed teeth. "I'm Mikhail Kashinenko," declared the white-haired man with the dark tech hand. "Chosen of Akan, and champion of Slunch." He spoke the name of the dark god like a lover's, and Elidio's shivered inside his power armor. "And this," he gestured to the spidery horror, "is Gargwestiel." He looked at the three of them. "I have to say, I was expecting Space Marines to be the first to make it here. How did you pass through Orpheus' delightful trick?" "Ah, no matter. In any case, you are too late." The heretic pointed to the pile of broken stone behind him with his cybernetic hand. "The information you sought is gone. You'll never find the Awakened One and stop him from unleashing the Ryaway Noah upon the galaxy once more." For a terrible instant, Elidio's feared that this was true, that everything they had done had been for nothing, that the Forsaken Sons had won. Then the Farseer's voice whispered in his mind, quieter than before. "Plus this creature is mistaken, Inquisitor. It is in my power to restore the stone, enough so that we can read what was writ upon it. Do not despair, but do not let it realize this. Plus." Years of service as an Inquisitor had honed Elidio's ability to roll with the unexpected, so he let none of the dread and sudden relief show in his face. Instead, he merely sneered. "Really? That's it? You thought that would discourage us?" He let out a short, mocking laugh. "If your masters really think the archive only contained a single record of the Nightmare Fleet's location, then they are even bigger fools than their allegiance to chaos suggests. There are many other such monuments across this complex, and we'll find them as soon as we've dealt with you. Believe what you will. It doesn't matter, you'll all die here anyway. Plus your deaths shall be neither quick nor pleasant. I shall enjoy seeing how much the weakling descendants of my kin can suffer before breaking. Plus." The Shailat's mental voice was completely different from the Farseer's. It felt like rusted nails plunging into his brain, and he felt physically ill at the contact. Next to Elidio's, Elithria shivered, and raised her staff, which began to glow with a pale, gentle light. The sense of violation eased, the telepathic intrusion of Gargwestiel repelled by her own psychic power. "Inquisitor, Farseer," said Tarek aloud in a calm voice, appearing completely unaffected by the Shailat's psychic intrusion. "It has been an honor meeting you. Fight well, and stop Arkan from winning. He does not deserve it." Before Elidio's could reply, Tarek moved, and he barely saw it happen. One moment the man was at his side, the next he was slamming into the Chosen of Arkan, suddenly moving at incredible speed without seeming to accelerate at all. The Inquisitor Lord was versed enough in the laws of physics to know that this should have killed him, but it was obvious Tarek was using psychic powers here, and those cared little for the laws of the materium. The impact didn't slow Tarek down, and he and Mikhail flew over the rubble of the steel and crashed through the wall behind. Surprisingly, the wall wasn't very thick, perhaps 1 meter, Elidio's judged, beyond which lay darkness. He blinked once, as every figure in the room remained immobile, stunned by what had just happened.
Then the cohorts of the Chosen screamed, and it all kicked off. Elithria thrust her staff in Gargwestiel's direction, and the two of them froze in place, the air around them rippling as their minds fought against each other in the immaterium, leaving Elidios to deal with the mutants. Their veils dropped, revealing two wide mouths full of shark-like teeth. The creatures moved with unnatural speed, leaping from place to place with sudden bursts of speed before stopping utterly still, their black eyes remaining on the party at all times. Elidios slammed his staff onto the floor and spoke an incantation, focusing his will through his weapon. The closest mutant erupted in white flames, her bestial screams echoing for a few seconds before her charred corpse hit the ground. As the pain of the backlash ran through his flesh, the Inquisitor Lord grinned defiantly at the other mutants.
"So? Which one of you is next?"
Intimidation didn't seem to work, as rather than hesitate they all screamed and charged him at once. Elidios spoke a different incantation, this one drastically increasing the speed of his personal time flow. With the mutants appearing to act in slow motion, he drew his pistol and shot 3 of them in the head, before raising his staff in front of him, right in time to block the claws of another as his spell ended and the normal passage of time reasserted itself. The bolt shells rushed out, slamming into the mutants and killing them instantly. Sheer incomprehension succeeded where fear had not, making the remaining 7 creatures hesitate for an instant. Elidios seized the opening and slammed his staff into the head of another, caving in her skull while firing blindly in the direction of the others, keeping in mind Elithria's position to avoid shooting his ally. He heard the sound of bolt shells hitting flesh. After the first time you heard it, you couldn't mistake it for anything else. He turned just in time to ram the barrel of his bolt pistol into the teeth of an approaching handmaiden, pulling the trigger and turning its skull to bloody dust. He hurled its headless corpse into the path of another, turned to avoid the claws of a third and shot it in the waist, the detonation tearing its body in 2. Which was when the last one jumped on his back and started biting at his arm as gorge it. Alarm runes flared in Elidios' vision as the seals started to give under its mutated strength. Before it could pierce through, the Inquisitor Lord spoke one more incantation, feeling several of his ribs crack and one of his teeth burst into pieces that lacerated the inside of his mouth. The last handmaiden had no time to scream before its neck abruptly twisted and broke, and it fell bonelessly to the ground. Elidios spat out a mix of blood, bile and broken teeth. Breathing heavily, he turned to where the Farseer still stood before the Shy Ilat. The 2 elders, though even the Inquisitor Lord had to admit there was little in common between the two, were immobile, but the air around them crackled with power. The Shy Ilat was too monstrous to read its body language, but it was clear that Elithria was struggling. Slowly, forcing himself through the pain racking his body from the backlash of using so many of his bag of tricks in quick succession, Elidios walked toward them, pulling out a new clip for his gun as he did so. Elithria remembered the first time she'd faced a more powerful soul than her own in a battle to the death. It had been many cycles ago, when she'd just begun walking the path of the seer. None of her teachers had been able to predict the rise of the beast, let alone the orcs' attack on the craft world. They had been caught by surprise, the green-skinned brutes boarding the craft world in a tide hundreds of thousands strong. Their not-so-primitive boarding crafts had crashed into the residential sections, forcing a massive evacuation that had left them dangerously vulnerable. Amidst the confusion, she had ended up facing one of the orc shamans, bloated on the power of so many of its kind. In both the realms of the flesh and spirit, a single blow would have destroyed her, and the battle had forced her to draw upon reserves of strength and cunning she hadn't known she possessed. Now, facing the abomination that called itself Gargwestiel, she would need to use every lesson she had learned in that duel and since, lest she meet a fate infinitely worse than what the orc would have done. Unlike the orc shaman, the Shy Ilat's power came entirely from within, drawing on the full psychic potential of the Eldar race in an unrestrained manner no child of Aisha had been able to do since the fall. Elithria could feel the gaze of she who thirsts being drawn by such a reckless use of power, like a knife lovingly stroking against her soul, waiting for the chance to plunge deep inside her. If the Shy Ilat felt it too, it gave no sign of it. But then, she supposed it wouldn't. Their minds clashed in the ether, forming and countering attacks as fast as their thoughts could conjure them. Kinetic strikes formed and dissolved, bursts of lightning were stillborn, and any attempt by the Shy Ilat to call forth the children of she who thirsts was smothered by Elithria. Their bodies remained distant,
But this was far more intimate than any physical combat, and despite Elethria's repulsion, she glimpsed fragments of Gargwestiel's nature through their exchange of psychic blows, just as it no doubt did from her. She saw that it was a gene lord, and had performed hideous experiments upon humans in its first life. She saw the horrors it had wrought from such fleshy clay, and how it had grown bored with them. She saw that it had given itself psychic powers in order to explore new avenues of research and entertainment. She saw that this creature, this monster, had made the other one, the one Tarek was fighting even now. It had saved the Chosen's life from his rightfully earned demise, and grafted onto him that awful hand of chaos-tainted technology. And it had done so out of curiosity. Just to see what would happen. A lifetime spent on the paths left the Farseer utterly unable to understand that attitude. Such evil had been unleashed, such destruction wrought, and not for the greater good of its people, but merely because it amused it to do so. She hated it, though her hate was focused through the lens of discipline by the training of the path. Plus you have shackled yourself, plus said the Gene Lord's voice in her head as it, too, received pieces of her own past. It sounded disappointed. Plus you could be so much more if you but had the courage to go past the limitations placed upon you. What a waste. Plus there is virtue in restraint, old monster, beyond seeking salvation from the horror your kind unleashed. Plus. Virtue? It scoffed. Plus virtue is for the weak. The strong pursue their own ambitions, regardless of the muling of others. Plus and yet, from it I have learned the importance of subtlety. Plus. She felt its puzzlement. Like the awkward boy before it, Gargwestiel hadn't seen her true ploy, too focused on the confrontation between them. Plus what are you, plus? Blam! The sound of a monkey brutish gun unloading pulled Elethria away from her focus just in time to see Gargwestiel's headless corpse fall to the ground. Elidio stood next to it, his smoking bolt gun held mere centimeters away from where the Shailat had stood. His torso was covered in gore, and he grimaced as he wiped off the worst of it from his face, his mouth tightly closed lest some of the Vilika find its way inside his body. You couldn't have done that from further away? Asked Elethria once she could speak. Didn't trust myself not to miss if it wasn't point blank, grunted the Inquisitor, his voice pained. As he lowered his gun, the Farseer saw that his hand was trembling. They were surrounded by the corpses of the mutants, but it was clear Elidio's hadn't escaped the confrontation unscathed. She turned her gaze back to the corpse of Gargwestiel, already falling apart as its unnatural biology broke down, and had to stop herself from spitting on it in front of the human. Tarek and Mikhail landed amidst a mountain of bones. It seemed the elders had overestimated the building skills of their ancestors. Somehow, one of the great mortuary pits the Imperium had dug for the nameless victims of the great beast had pierced through the walls of the Archive of Loss, flowing this section with human remains. The walls were lined with statues of severe-looking Eldar lords, each over 100 meters high and buried in bones up to their waists. They were covered with incredibly detailed suits of armor that shone with a pale light, casting shifting shadows across the chamber. The two fighters stood up cautiously, finding precarious balance on the pile of bones and eyeing each other warily. Whatever Mikhail had done to breach the sound-deafening field extended to this section of the archive, their fall had made a ruckus fit to wake up the dead. Not literally, of course, which was unfortunate. The 7-in-1 who were Tarek were afraid. They could feel the power of the Chosen of Arkan before them, and that of the hideous thing grafted to his arm. The Eldar souls of their Gestalt had spent centuries eluding Slansh after the death of their flesh during the Great Crusade, and now they faced one of the goddess champions. Ironically, it was the human soul among them, who had faced the horrors of Paraxis without flinching, that let them stand their ground. Mikhail stretched his limbs and cracked his neck, purple eyes never leaving Tarek. He drew his sword with his left hand, while the jewel embedded in his right hand flared, casting scarlet light over the bones and making their surrounding look like some ancient vision of hell. Well, said the Chosen slowly. That was unexpected. I thought the delightful scent above came from the Eldar witch, but I see now there is more to you than meets the eye. Tarek looked at his pistol, then discarded it. It wouldn't serve him against this foe. Instead, he took up his chainsword in a two-handed grip. What do you think will happen to your soul when your body dies? Asked the Chosen in a conversational tone. Will it fall in the warp, where the demons of the Dark Prince await? Or will it be torn apart between these stones in your flesh?
Tarek didn't know. He had tried very hard not to think about it. Even the seer souls did not know, because their collective existence was, as far as they knew, unprecedented. Now Mikhail was growing frustrated by Tarek's lack of response. The Chosen didn't know, couldn't know, that talking had become harder and harder since his escape from the warp and his arrival on Mayan Tor. He was 7 minds alloyed into one, and that union had not been without cost. The Prime Personality had remained Tarek of Paraxis, the one who, ironically, could best communicate both with the Imperium and with the Elders, for his mind had been undamaged by centuries of borderless existence and torment by the traitor legions. But every time he fought, every time he used skills and power that had belonged to the 6 Eldar witches whose souls had been fused to his own, that personality faded away and the gestalt grew. Nothing to say? Very well. I will make you scream, then. They clashed amidst the bones, Tarek's chainsword meeting Mikhail's blade. The two of them moved in defiance of gravity, Tarek drawing upon the Soulstone's power and Mikhail on his black hands. They flew over the bones like spirits fighting beneath the gaze of old gods. Beams of eldritch light leapt from the Chosen's black hand, scorching the walls where they hit. It took all of Tarek's power to avoid being skewered by Mikhail's sword or incinerated by the beams. If he was lucky, he suspected contact with this fell energy would do much worse than kill. Mikhail was a skilled swordsman, his abilities further enhanced by gene forging and the gifts of his dark god. With eyes not of flesh, Tarek could see the influence of the Dark Prince, that had slowly reshaped the Chosen's body over the years, one alteration at a time, keeping only the outward appearance unchanged while remaking what laid beneath. No doubt Mikhail thought of these as boons, too blinded by pride and power to see them for the curses they were, each one another hook in his soul, dragging him forever closer to she who thirsts waiting more. He saw other things, too many, in truth. His brain remained only a human brain, not capable of processing all that even one singular Eldar mind was capable of, and he had 6 working together with him. He couldn't understand everything, but he didn't need to. The rune-marked sword cut through his flak armor and scored a wound on his leg. The entire limb started to burn, and the stones in his arm flared as they fought off the curse spreading inside his flesh. Tarek fell back to dodge the follow-up flurry of blows, propelling himself into the air backward until his back hit the wall, at the foot of one of the statues lining the pit of bones. Tarek forced his lips into a smile. "Come on, Albert," he said, taunting the Chosen. "Show me what you are really capable of." The Chosen's perfect face was distorted by a grimace of violent hatred as Tarek threw his old name, the name he had abandoned when his path had crossed that of the Awakened One, right in his face. With a wordless shriek of outrage, he leapt at Tarek, all notion of playing with him abandoned. The rune-marked sword battered Tarek's chainsword aside, and the black hand buried itself in his chest and burst out of his back, holding his beating heart. Fresh blood poured on old bones in torrents, and Tarek knew that he was dead. No amount of psychic power would save him now, but it could keep him alive just a few more seconds, long enough for him to make his last gambit. "Your torments are only beginning," hissed the champion of Slunch. "No," replied Tarek with something like relief. "They are finally ended." Because Mikhail, Albert, now stood exactly where Tarek had needed him to. He spoke a single sentence in the old Eldar tongue, forcing his human mouth to form words meant for Zeno's lips. Mikhail cocked his head, frowning, and then the ancient security systems of the Archive of Loss, dormant for thousands of years, were activated, fueled by all the power the Soulstones could channel and turned on by a being just Eldar enough to trick them. The statue behind Tarek moved, impossible fast for something its size. Even so, Albert saw it coming, but Tarek clasped both hands around his forearm, where dark tech met gene-forged flesh, and held him in place. The Chosen of Arkan had just enough time to start screaming before the giant golem unleashed a stream of white fire from its open mouth. Skin and muscle burned first, then bone, then the metal of the black hand melted, before the red jewel cracked and exploded, sending the howling thing that had been bound within since the dark age of technology hurling back to the realms of chaos. When the fire finally stopped, only 6 soulstones were left, resting on the floor of the chamber, until the sea of bones shifted, and they vanished from sight under the tide of Imperial remains. Back in the domed chamber, Elithria and Elidios heard the eldritch fire being unleashed, and felt its heat through the hole Tarek had made in the wall. "Was that?" asked the Inquisitor hesitantly.
Yes, replied the Eldar. They are both dead.
She gestured with her staff and her free hand, weaving arcane patterns in the air. The fragments of white stone twitched, then rose, as if a pick recording were playing in reverse. But saying it like that undersold the complexity of the task. This wasn't like putting a puzzle together with telekina power. Some of the fragments were no larger than a grain of sand, and others had been vaporized completely. The Farseer was effectively doing nothing less than reverse the flow of time, restoring things inside a small space to what they had been before Mikhail Kashinenko's desecration. Eventually, the pieces reformed into a steel covered in arcane symbols Elidios was fairly certain were a star chart of some kind, with a wicked-looking rune at the center he took to mean the location of the Ryaway Nora itself. With a sigh, Elithria let go of her spell, and the steel shivered and crumbled back into pieces. "Do you have it?" he asked. "Yes," she answered, sounding as exhausted as he felt. "I have found the path that will lead us to the Anchor of Vul." "Good," said a third, equally exhausted voice. The Farseer and the Inquisitor Lord turned to see Alphon enter the room. His power armor was dented and splattered with splashes of black liquid. He held his drawn sword in one hand, and in the other an oversized skull that was still biting at the air, lidless eyes open wide in horror. "I dealt with our pursuer," said Alphon, lifting up the morbid trophy. "We're going to need to find somewhere to lock that away, though. Nothing I did to it seemed to kill it." He looked around at the room and the corpses. "Where is Tarek?" On the surface of Neril, Orpheus breathed out, still kneeling at the center of his summoning circle. He had sensed the death of Mikhail, the passing of the Chosen echoing through the Sea of Souls, and knew what it meant. They had failed in their mission here. Somehow the allied Imperials and Elders had found a way into the archive. Maybe Mikhail had managed to destroy their target before their arrival, maybe not. In the end, it didn't matter. There was no reason to stay here anymore. The other Chosen really should have taken more of an escort than that old monster Garguestiel and his pets. Even the gifts of the Dark Prince and the surgeries of the Fleshmasters could only do so much to turn the daughters of corrupt imperial nobility they had conquered in the Wailing Storm into effective fighters. But Mikhail had been convinced he needed no protection, and truth be told, after seeing him use that hand of his, Orpheus had been unable to argue the point. He turned on his armor's vox, reaching out to his brothers in the void. Despite the distance, the link was quickly established, filling the sorcerer's ears with the pleasant sounds of screaming and battle. "Tacitus," he called to his legion brother. After a few seconds, when no reply came, he repeated, louder, "Tacitus." "Lord Orpheus. My apologies. There was the sound of flesh tearing apart and bolt of fire, a mite busy over here." "I am aware, but I'm afraid I have to interrupt your fun. Get your warriors out of the Eldar ships and back to the fleet." "What? Why?" "Mikhail is dead," said Orpheus bluntly. "The enemy has what they came for. We've no reason to stay here any longer." "We've plenty of reasons," objected the Chaos Marine. "There are thousands of Elders in this system to send to Slunch." "We are losing this battle, Tacitus," the sorcerer explained with a patient tone honed by decades of managing the Slayer-Ineshi devotees of the Warband. "Only my sorcery keeps the Imperials and their Xenos allies at bay, and there's no point defending this place if the secrets it keeps are already in their hands. Sooner or later my strength will wane, and we'll be crushed on the surface. And once the descendants of Sanguinius, thin-blooded or not, join the battle in orbit, do you think we'll stand a chance there? No, we must depart immediately. I'm calling a gunship to bring me and my retinue back to orbit, then we'll fight our way out of the system." For a moment, Orpheus thought Tacitus would disobey him, too caught up in the joy of hunting Elders aboard their own vessels. But in the end, either his respect for the Chosen's authority or his own self-preservation instincts led him to agree. "Very well, Lord. We'll return to the Oblivion's Keeper." "Do so," replied Orpheus, cutting off the link and opening a new one. It took several minutes to convince the captain of the Bite of Darkness, Mikhail's personal ship in the fleet, that his lord was dead and that Orpheus was now his superior, by virtue of being the only Chosen of Archon left in the system as well as being able to fry his brain from the surface with a psychic effort if he continued to refuse him. From there, orders were spread to the rest of the Chaos ships in the void, and by the time the gunship delivered Orpheus to the landing bay of the demon ship Oblivion's Keeper, the Slayer-Ineshi host was in full retreat. Their enemies immediately took advantage, forcing Orpheus to sacrifice several of the weaker and most damaged ships to cover their retreat. In the end, only the Bite of Darkness, the Oblivion's Keeper, and a handful of the Shai-Lat-owned vessels. Nearly all of the Slayer-Ineshi elders had perished on the surface, but enough had remained in orbit to keep their ships under control. Already resurrection rituals were beginning in their depths to return the slain to life, though it would be many months, years, even, before all of the dead walked once more in the realm of flesh. Orpheus hadn't been completely honest with Tacitus. With his necromancy and the flesh forges of the Shai-Lat, they could conceivably have reinforced their ranks and turned the Battle of Neril into a protracted campaign, hunkering down on the planet and taking refuge in the catacombs. But he knew something the other Forsaken Sons didn't, that the Grey Knights were coming, and would join with the Imperials soon. At that point, one of two things would happen: either they would kill every asset of the Warband in the system, or they would take the information extracted from the Archive of Loss and leave to deal with the greater threat that Archon represented. Given what he knew of his lord's plans, Orpheus was inclined to think it would be the latter, but he saw no reason to risk his life on a gamble that, in truth, would bring him nothing. Oh, they could have some fun with the Nerilites, true, but there were many other worlds in the Azeroth sector that were poorly defended and full of many, many more people than the cemetery world. No, his part in the Black Crusade was over. Now it was time to ensure he would survive it.